What happens when the world's most volatile superpower turns energy into a weapon? The answer to that question reveals far more than a regional dispute. It reveals why, in 2026, stability has become the most valuable and the rarest commodity in the Western Hemisphere. Breaking tonight. America's energy strategy has just crossed a line. Washington has announced a total oil blockade on Cuba, enforced indirectly through the sudden seizure of Venezuela's oil flows. The expectation across financial markets was almost unanimous. Analysts predicted Havana would fold within weeks. Political observers assumed the island had no alternatives. Commentators spoke openly about inevitable capitulation. They were all wrong. On January 11, 2026, standing on his Truth Social platform, President Donald Trump made the new doctrine explicit. There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. They should make a deal before it is too late. In one sentence, American energy policy was redefined. Energy was no longer a commodity. It was now a lever, a pressure tool, a weapon. The message to the hemisphere was unmistakable. Access to energy is conditional. Obedience buys supply. Independence risks darkness. But this crisis did not begin with a tweet. Just days earlier, U.S. forces had carried out a high-risk military operation inside Venezuela. President Nicolas Maduro was not arrested. He was captured. The operation killed 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel stationed in Venezuela under security cooperation agreements. The political shock was immediate. The economic shock was even faster. Within hours, Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba stopped completely. 26,500 barrels per day vanished overnight. That single number matters more than any speech or headline. Those 26,500 barrels represented roughly half of Cuba's oil deficit. In one move, 50% of the island's external energy lifeline was cut. Almost simultaneously, Washington and Caracas began negotiating a $2 billion deal to redirect Venezuelan oil to U.S. refineries. The money would not go to Venezuela's government. It would be held in U.S. supervised accounts. In other words, the oil stays in the system. But the leverage, the control, and the cash flow moved to Washington. From the White House perspective, the strategy looked perfect. Cuba would lose Venezuelan oil. The U.S. would control the replacement flows. Havana would face blackouts, shortages, economic pressure, and eventually political submission. That was the theory. But theories collapse when reality refuses to cooperate. Within hours of Trump's ultimatum, Cuba's foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez, responded with a statement that was calm, legalistic, and deeply strategic. Cuba has the right to import fuel from any suppliers willing to export it. This was not defiance, this was positioning. Because while Trump was communicating through social media, Cuban officials were already working the phones. Not with Washington, with Mexico, and with others. They were not asking for charity. They were asking a different question altogether. Who is willing to build a long-term energy relationship that does not collapse when politics change? This is the part that American strategists failed to anticipate. For more than a century, U.S. policy toward the Caribbean and Latin America has relied on the same assumption. Control the choke points. Control the outcomes. Control shipping lanes. Control finance. Control energy. Then issue ultimatums and wait for compliance. It worked many times before. But this time, the context is different. This time, energy markets are tighter. Supply chains are more complex. And most importantly, trust in American reliability has eroded badly. When one military operation can eliminate half of a country's oil supply overnight, and one presidential post can threaten total energy isolation, every government in the region starts asking the same question. What happens to us when we are next? Cuba is not collapsing. It is recalculating. And that recalculation is happening in a hemisphere where one country, quietly and methodically, has spent decades building the exact opposite reputation of Washington. Not coercion, not ultimatums, reliability. Canada. While American policy is now defined by volatility, threats, and sudden reversals, Canada's energy sector has built its influence on something far less dramatic and far more powerful: predictability. And that difference is about to reshape the strategic map of the Western Hemisphere. Because this crisis is not really about Cuba. It is about what happens when nations realize that energy security, based on American goodwill, is no longer security at all. And that realization is spreading. If Part 1 explained how Washington turned energy into a weapon, Part 2 explains why that decision may become one of the most expensive strategic mistakes the United States has made in the Western Hemisphere in decades. Because energy markets do not just price barrels and pipelines, they price trust. And right now, trust is the one thing American policy is destroying faster than any supply chain disruption ever could. Let's start with the hard numbers. Venezuela had been supplying Cuba with approximately 26,500 barrels per day. At current prices, that is roughly $47 million per month, over $500 million per year in energy support. That flow vanished overnight after Maduro's capture. Mexico stepped in partially. President Claudia Sheinbaum publicly acknowledged that Mexico had become a more important supplier to Cuba. But she was also very clear about one thing: Mexico did not dramatically increase volumes. The political signal mattered more than the quantity. That leaves a gap of roughly 13,000 barrels per day. For American oil giants, that is noise, a rounding error, not worth the political friction, not worth the regulatory complexity, not worth the reputational risk. For Canadian energy companies, that is something very different. That is exactly the size of relationship that builds strategic footholds. Canada produces about 5.2 million barrels per day. It exports over 4.2 million. It has refining capacity. It has transport infrastructure. It has decades of experience operating in politically complex environments. And crucially, it has something that Washington has just demonstrated it no longer offers: continuity. Canadian energy policy does not change with every election cycle. Canadian export contracts do not disappear because of one leader's temper. Canadian supply chains are boring. And in energy markets, boring is priceless. This is where the contrast between Ottawa and Washington becomes impossible to ignore. Trump's strategy toward Cuba is built on a simple logic: isolate, starve, pressure, extract concessions. It is coercion economics. Mark Carney's approach, by contrast, reflects a different philosophy. Build long-term commercial relationships, respect sovereignty, and let interdependence do the stabilizing work. That difference is not academic. It changes how every government in the region calculates risk. Look at Canada's recent history. During the NAFTA renegotiations, when Washington threatened tariffs, accused Canada of being a national security risk, and imposed steel and aluminum duties, Canada did not retaliate by cutting energy flows. It kept oil and gas moving. It honored contracts. It maintained supply even when political relations were tense. That behavior was noticed, not just in Washington, in every capital that depends on imported energy. The CIA's own internal assessment, leaked to Reuters, admits the reality Washington would rather not acknowledge. Cuba's economy is strained. Yes, agriculture is under pressure. Tourism is weak. Blackouts are frequent. But strained is not collapsed. Difficult is not defeated. And struggling is not surrendering. Cuba does not need miracles. It needs reliability. And reliability is exactly what American policy has just demonstrated it cannot guarantee. When a single military operation can remove half your energy supply, and a single social media post can threaten to remove the rest, the rational response is not submission. The rational response is diversification. That is what Cuba is doing, and it is what many other countries are quietly preparing to do as well. Here is the deeper strategic shift that most analysts are missing. This is not just about one country finding replacement barrels. This is about a repricing of political risk across the entire hemisphere. Every finance ministry, every energy planner, every infrastructure authority is now running the same scenario. What happens if Washington decides our energy access is suddenly conditional? That question used to be theoretical. It is now operational. And once that question enters the risk models, capital flows start to change. Long-term contracts start to shift. Infrastructure investments start to follow stability instead of power. This is the stability premium, and Canada is perfectly positioned to collect it. Not because Canada is the largest producer, not because Canada is the cheapest, but because Canada is the least likely to turn energy into a political ambush. There is another layer to this that makes Washington's strategy even more self-defeating. The U.S. intelligence community already knows that the Cuban collapse narrative is exaggerated. Their own assessments say it plainly. Pressure will hurt, but it will not break the state quickly. What it will do is accelerate Havana's search for partners who do not weaponize supply. And once those relationships are built, they do not disappear when a crisis ends. They become permanent. This is how influence is lost quietly, without a single treaty being torn up. Not through defeat, through replacement. And that replacement is being built right now, not in press conferences, but in contracts, shipping schedules, and quiet diplomatic calls. While Washington is demonstrating volatility, Ottawa is demonstrating patience. While Trump is issuing ultimatums, Canada is offering something far more dangerous to American leverage: normal business. And in geopolitics, nothing undermines coercion faster than proving it is unnecessary. What we are witnessing right now is not just a dispute between Washington and Havana. It is the beginning of a structural shift in how power works in the Western Hemisphere. For more than a century, the United States relied on a simple principle: control the flows, and you control the politics. Control trade routes, control finance, control energy. And when necessary, turn those systems into pressure points. That model worked because America was seen as both indispensable and predictable. Today, it is still indispensable, but it is no longer predictable. And in global energy markets, unpredictability is not a feature. It is a fatal flaw. Trump believes he is demonstrating strength by cutting off Venezuela's oil to Cuba, by threatening Havana with total energy starvation, and by turning fuel into a bargaining chip. What he is actually demonstrating is something far more dangerous to American influence. He is demonstrating that any country that depends on the United States for energy security is only one political mood swing away from crisis. That is not power. That is risk. And risk is exactly what every serious government in the hemisphere is now trying to reduce. This is why this moment goes far beyond Cuba. Every energy-importing nation in Latin America is watching this closely. Every government is asking the same question in private meetings. What happens if we are next? What happens if a dispute over migration, trade, elections, or foreign policy suddenly becomes an energy ultimatum? Once that question enters strategic planning, the response is inevitable. You build alternatives. You diversify suppliers. You reduce dependence on any partner that has shown a willingness to weaponize supply. This is how influence erodes without a single battle being lost. Not through confrontation. Through quiet substitution. Cuba is simply the first visible case, but it will not be the last. Here is the deeper irony. For decades, the United States benefited enormously from being the anchor of hemispheric stability. Countries accepted American dominance because it came with reliability. Contracts were respected. Supply chains were boring. Crises were managed quietly. That reputation is now being dismantled by American policy itself. Not by China, not by Russia, not by anyone else. By Washington. And that creates a vacuum. Not a military vacuum. A trust vacuum. And trust, once broken in energy markets, is almost impossible to rebuild. This is where Canada's role becomes strategically transformative. Canada is not trying to replace the United States as a hegemon. It does not have the ambition, the ideology, or the military posture for that. What Canada offers is something much more subtle and, in this context, much more powerful. Continuity, reliability, contracts that survive elections, supply chains that do not collapse because of political theater, energy relationships that are commercial, not emotional. That sounds boring, But boring is exactly what countries want when their economies depend on the lights staying on. This is why the stability premium matters. It is why capital flows, long-term supply agreements, and infrastructure investments will increasingly favor partners who do not treat energy as a weapon. Once that shift begins, it becomes self-reinforcing. New routes get built, new terminals get financed, new contracts get signed, and slowly, almost invisibly, the old center of gravity weakens. Not because it was defeated, because it was bypassed. This is the part Washington is not prepared for. Power based on coercion looks strong, until the day it stops being necessary. The moment countries can say no without collapsing, the leverage is gone. And that moment is getting closer. Look at the numbers again. Cuba does not need miracles. It needs about 13,000 barrels per day from reliable suppliers. Canada can provide that without even noticing. Mexico is already providing part of it. Others will follow. And once that supply web is built, the threat of energy blackmail becomes irrelevant. The same logic will apply elsewhere. Central America, the Caribbean, parts of South America. All of them are watching. All of them are learning the same lesson. Never let your survival depend on a partner who treats your economy as a pressure point. This is how empires lose influence in the 21st century. Not through war, through optionality, through alternatives, through the quiet construction of systems that no longer need them. Trump thinks he is forcing the hemisphere to choose. What he is actually doing is teaching it how to escape. And here is the final brutal truth. Energy security used to be about access to resources. Now it is about access to trustworthy partners. The United States is still rich in resources, but it is rapidly bankrupting its credibility. Canada, by contrast, is not the biggest producer, not the cheapest, not the loudest, but it is becoming something far more valuable in a world of weaponized interdependence. It is becoming predictable, and in the coming decade, predictability will be worth more than raw power. So this is not the story of Cuba. This is the story of a system changing, of a hemisphere quietly rebalancing, of a world learning, once again, that stability beats intimidation in the long run. Trump wanted to show strength. He may end up being remembered as the man who taught his neighbors how to live without him.